Hello, everyone. So I just want to talk briefly about some of the conceptions of object perception. You could basically think of this as a history of some basic ideas of how we explain the fact that we're able to perceive objects in our environment and in our world. And probably the first idea to talk about is something called unconscious inference, which was proposed by Hermann Helmholtz. And basically, what Helmholtz struggled with is you realize that the image that's projected onto the retina is really ambiguous. And so the ambiguity here comes from the fact that we're really taking, in the real world, what's a three-dimensional image, and when light is reflected off that image and it hits the retina, it goes from being three-dimensional to two-dimensional. And so everything that's represented on our retina is measured in two-dimensional space. It's a flat object, just like a piece of paper. And because of that, because we lack the ability to see depth, which we'll not really talk about in this course, but if you take my perception course, we talk about it. But what ends up happening is we lose a lot of information by losing that one dimension. And specifically, that information we lose is depth, which tells us what objects really look like and how they relate to each other. And so a good example of this is this idea that's demonstrated here in the slide. And so basically what we see here is we see the two-dimensional image that's projected on our retina. Now we will probably interpret that two-dimensional image as there's a blue rectangle and it's overlaying a sorry. There's a blue rectangle that's overlapping a red rectangle. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In fact, what could actually be is we have a blue square, and then right on top we have an L-shaped red square. Because we don't have that depth information, that particular image is ambiguous to us. We don't know if it really is a full red rectangle in the background and a blue rectangle laying over top of it or overlapping it, or if there's some other shape that we're just not able to perceive because of the conversion from three to two dimensions. And so that's really what Helmholtz was trying to get at. And so in order to explain these a shortcut or inferences that we make, he developed something called the likelihood principle. And basically, with the likelihood principle, the perceptual system just prefers to take the most likely interpretation of a stimulus there is. So it's pretty unlikely that we're going to have a red L rectangle in the background with a blue rectangle overlapping it, right? It is more likely that we're going to have, say, two pieces of colored paper overlapping each other. And so that's how we're going to, or the perceptual system is going to interpret that ambiguous stimuli. Another example comes over here. So when I ask people, well, what do you assume that the house looks like behind this truck? Most people are going to say that there's just a small window that's covered up by this particular truck, and it's going to look like all the other windows in the house. Now, based on what we know, that makes a lot of sense. But what we can see is when the truck moves away, maybe that's not necessarily the case. In fact, there's just one really long window here. Now, it's not wrong for our perceptual system to say, okay, small windows, it looks like there's a pattern going on in the building, and the most likely thing that we're going to see if that truck was in the way is another small window. And that's the likelihood principle. We just pick up on what is most common or likely in the environment, and our perceptual system interprets the world that way. Now, occasionally there are errors, but by and large, just making those assumptions or using the likelihood principle, most of the time we're going to be correct. And so that's the idea behind unconscious inference. Now we're going to shift gears to talk a little bit about a different idea of how we perceive objects, and that's an idea called Gestaltism. And Gestaltism is just a basic idea for how we organize the world around us, and basically how the perceptual system interprets the organization of patterns around us. And the Gestaltists really kind of came out of some early work by Wundt. And basically what Wundt was arguing is that in order to perceive a face, we don't really perceive a face. Instead, what we do is we take the individual parts of the face, we take a mouth, a nose, eyes, and we add all those parts together, and that's what gives us the percept of a face. So according to Wundt, basically perception is we just add up all the individual parts, put them together, and we perceive whatever the object is that we're looking at. Now, Gestaltists argued that that isn't necessarily the case, that there are times where the whole is different from the sum of its parts, where the whole is bigger than if we just individually added up each of the individual parts. And so give me 1 second and I will explain what I mean for that, but I really want to highlight when it comes to Gestalt psychology, the main idea can really be wrapped up as the whole is different from the sum of its parts. So I'm going to deviate from the slide here a little bit, but basically where the first idea, or at least the story of the idea behind Gestaltism comes from is it was back a long time ago, I believe in the 1800s, and what happened was that a researcher got onto a train, and on the train he noticed that there was a kid playing with a stroboscope. And if you don't know what a stroboscope is, if you think back and you've ever seen those little, they're usually wooden toys where there is a circle up top and they're individual pictures on that circle, and what you do is you look through some sort of a viewfinder and you spin that wooden top, and if you spin it fast enough, then those individual pictures that are in the toy move together and it looks like a horse jumping over a fence or something like that. That's what a stroboscope is. And so this was being watched, and what was realized is that something there is greater than just the individual parts that make it up, right? And so this is an idea, let me step back a second here. This is an idea of apparent movement, okay? If we take a bunch of still images and we present, there's movement within the images, if we present them fast enough to people, then what they're going to see is they're going to see some sort of movement. And so this is the entire idea behind movies, where, right, movies are just individual still frames pieced together so that it looks like the people are moving if it's played fast enough, or if you've ever drawn in any textbooks or anything like that, and on the pages, and then you flip through the pages really quick, there'll be a stick figure that's doing something. At least in my textbooks, they were always doing some sort of obscene thing. But right, like the stick figures are doing some sort of an action. This is also the idea behind cartoons, is this idea of apparent movement. And the idea of apparent movement is basically we perceive movement even though nothing is really moving, right? We're just looking at individual still pictures, but if they're presented fast enough and with the right amount of movement, then what we perceive is that the object that we're looking at is moving. And that's what's going on with the stroboscope here. And this really caught the researchers' attention because we couldn't just add up the individual parts of the pictures. We actually got something bigger, right? The whole was greater. We saw this in the case of this toy, it was a horse jumping over a fence, but we saw this these still pictures of a horse and a fence. Suddenly, if they were presented fast enough, we saw him as the horse jumping over the fence. And so this suggested that we couldn't just add up the individual pictures. There was something greater going on. There was a bigger thing that came up whenever we put all these parts together. And so this led Gestalt psychologists to try to find regularities or patterns or different ways that elements are typically grouped together to create some sort of a larger object. And so this idea here is just what their principles of perceptual organization are. And so you can refer to them as principles of perceptual organization. Some people go as far as to say laws of perceptual organization. And we'll go into some of them to highlight the basic idea that Gestaltists were trying to get at. But the main thing to take away is this is actually just a small collection of some of them. Actually, a lot more than we'll be talking about. But the first one I want to talk about is an idea called good continuation. And basically, the idea behind good continuation is that when you have points, when those points are connected together, they result in a straight or smoothly curving line and are perceived to be belonging together. And so one of the main things to take away with the idea of good continuation is that traditionally objects in our environment tend to take the smoothest paths possible. And so a good example of this is we have some branches. So let's say we're out hiking and we see these branches behind the tree, and maybe it's very Blair Witchian, but they're not actually branches on the tree. They're just for some reason located behind it. And usually when people see this, what they assume is that there's one long straight branch coming down like this, and there's another long straight branch coming up. Now, because the tree is in the way, we don't know for sure. But the other alternative, or the other way that we could interpret that ambiguous information, is that we have a V-shaped stick going in an upright position and a V-shaped stick going into a downright position. Now, that's a lot less likely, and as I'm saying that, you're like, well, branches don't really work like that. That's the idea of good continuation. Usually things in our environment follow smooth, normal, continuous curving lines. They don't make sudden and abrupt shifts into a different direction and then shift back to that direction. Mostly things take a very smooth, regular pattern. And that's the idea of good continuation. Another Gestalt principle is the idea of something called good figure or simplicity. And basically the idea with good figure is that we perceive patterns or sorry, that patterns are perceived so that the resulting object is as simple as possible. And so, for example, here, the way that we typically perceive this Olympic sign is we perceive it as 5 circles overlapping each other, right? Now, we could perceive it and group it in different ways so that we have 4 football-shaped objects with 2 I don't know, weird eyeball things. And the point is, before I go too far into that explanation, is that we take the simplest route possible, right? And we see just 5 circles, and those 5 circles are overlapping, and that's the simplest explanation for how we can group that object in our environment. Similarly, going back to our tree example, here if we see an X, we perceive that as one straight backslash line and one straight forward slash line. I may have flipped the size, but you know what I'm saying. We see it as 2 straight lines crossing over each other. Again, we could see it as 2 V-shaped lines connecting to each other, but that's not as simple, right, as a simple straight line crossed with another straight line. Or if we were to see something like this image here, where if we had to interpret what this image was, we might, we could come up with all sorts of weird shapes that it looks like. But if we look at it, it looks like it's a rectangle, a circle, and a triangle, and that's the simplest way to organize or perceive that object. And so, we say that it looks something like this as opposed to some sort of weird combination of like a squirrely circle in the bottom corner and whatnot. So idea good figure or simplicity is really just that objects are interpreted as simple as possible manner. Another Gestalt principle is the idea of similarity. And the idea of similarity basically says similar things are grouped together. So for example, here we have a series of dots, black dots in a vertical line, followed by a series of red dots in a vertical line, and then black line of vertical dots. And basically, when we perceive this, what we perceive is these dots being grouped together in one vertical line because they're similar in color, and this line being grouped together because it's similar in color too. Or another good example of this is here, if we were to see these shapes, it's going to be interpreted in the simplest way possible, but also based on similarity, where we have, sorry, I've lost my mouse here, where we have a series of squares that are organized together to make a plus sign, and then circles off to the side. Again, in the case here, most people, when they look at this, they see an eagle with the rays of the sun behind it. The rays of the sun get grouped together because they're all triangles, and so because they're all triangles, they are perceived as grouping or belonging together in some sort of a group form. So the idea of similarity is just that we group similar objects together. With the idea of proximity, the idea here, we just group together objects that are near each other. So for example, if we look at this cat paw over here, we're going to group these dots as belonging to each other and are different because they're close together, and they're going to be different from this group of dots over here, which also this is grouped into a separate pattern, but it's going to be grouped differently because it's not close to the other dots. And so in the case of proximity, we just tend to take nearby objects, and if objects are nearby, we group them together. Another Gestalt principle is the idea of common fate. And the idea of common fate is basically anytime that you have objects moving in the same direction as each other, then they're all grouped together too. And so good examples of this are in the, when the birds are returning, either in the spring or migrating in the fall. One of the things that you'll notice is that you don't perceive the individual birds. Instead, you see the V pattern of the birds migrating and you group that together instead of seeing individual birds because they're all moving in the same direction together. Similarly, things happen whenever we see groups of planes. We don't necessarily see the individual planes or perceive the individual planes, but we see a large group of planes that must belong together because they're all heading into the same direction. Same type of idea happens with schools of fish too. This is the idea of common fate, where we group things together just because they're moving in the same direction as each other. Another Gestalt idea of grouping is the idea of common region. And basically in common region, objects that are in the same region of space tend to be grouped together. And so I really like this example because if we were to go outside and see that there was some sort of a protest going on, one of the ways, if we were to see a sign that looked like this, the way that we would interpret this based on common region is we would say that it was an anti-war rally, right? Stop War belongs together because it's in this white box, and Peace Now belongs together because it's in this gray box. Now, one of the things that would happen though is if we saw a different sign like this, we would think that it's actually a pro-war rally, right? Stop Peace get grouped together because they're within a common region, and War Now get grouped together because they're in a common region, in this case, a light gray box. Okay, now common region actually comes up a lot in, well, design in general, but we see it a lot on the internet because I'm sure you can all think of cases where things were badly grouped. And usually whenever things are badly grouped, this is a problem with common region. Somebody's messed up the common region, and so we see things in an incorrect way or an unclear way. However, if we take things like, I'm blanking on what the website, Pinterest. If we take things like Pinterest, one of the nice things about Pinterest is that it does a great job of setting up common regions. So let's say we're looking at Chuck Norris's Pinterest page. We could see that he has a section that belongs to trucks, and all of that belongs together because it's in one region, and another one of memes related to Chuck Norris, and we can see that because it's in a common region here, identified by the black box around it. So usually if you see bad web design, usually there's an issue with common region. The final Gestalt principle I want to talk about is something called uniform connectedness. And the idea of uniform connectedness is that there's a connected region that just has the same visual properties. And if they have these similar properties, they're grouped together. And so, for example, here, because we have a connection, right? So this differs from the example that we saw earlier, where now we have a vertical line of blue dots and pink dots, but that's not the way that we interpret it. We actually interpret it differently because there's a connection between it. So now we see a blue-pink barbell and then another row of blue-pink barbells. And so the idea with uniform connectedness is these are connected to each other through some sort of a physical connection, and because of that, we'll group them based on that physical connection as opposed to separating them by their different color. This also pops up a lot of times in comic books. With comic books, one of the reasons that they use different connections is to make it clear who's speaking or who's saying what, or whether they're having this idea as a thought or this is something they're verbally saying. And so I use this example, even though it's small, to highlight the fact that we're not really sure what's going on here, but because of uniform connectedness and the information that we're getting, we're able to connect these ideas to the person that's saying it, and it allows us to understand what this conversation between those two people are. So hopefully that helps explain the history of Gestalt psychology, some of the ideas that preceded Gestalt psychology, and also highlight some of the basic Gestalt principles. If you do have any questions or anything like that, definitely reach out. I'm always happy to help.